Welcome to the Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. Daniel Pink believes that regret is our most misunderstood emotion. In his quest to reclaim the power of regret as a force for good, Dan has written a breakthrough book that speaks to regret as a key component of human existence, an emotion that prompts us to look backwards in order to clarify how we want to move forwards. Today on The Voice of Retail, I talk with Dan about his own relationship to regret, what inspired him to study this tumultuous emotion, and some of the key research points and insights from his latest book, The Power of Regret, How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward. Stay tuned for insights on reconnecting with regret and what we can learn from the 16,000 regrets that people from all over the world submitted to Dan's online platform.
Yeah, I agree. I think that part of it is pride and ego. Now, here's the other thing, the dirty little secret, is that when we disclose our regrets, or even when we disclose any of our vulnerabilities, mistakes, setbacks, whatever, we fear that people will think less of us. And there's 30 years of research in behavioral science showing that that's wrong. They often think more of us.
Let's listen in now. Well, Dan, welcome back to the podcast, my friend. How are you doing?
I am doing well. Thanks for having me back.
Well, it's not the first time you and I've talked, not the first time you and I have been on the microphone, so it's great to hear your voice, if not see you in person. You got another book out, The Power of Regret. I want to talk all about it. I've read the book. I've had an advance copy, and it's out today, or just out this week, so everyone can share. But I'm really excited to kind of jump in and explore. Why don't we jump right in with just a bit about yourself? And for those maybe that didn't hear our first interview or don't know of you or don't know enough about you, tell us about yourself.
I am a writer based in Washington, D.C. I write books about work and life and business and behavior. And this book that's coming out right now is my 7th book. And it takes a deep look at our most misunderstood emotion, which is regret. And tries to reclaim it as a force for good and help people think differently and more sensibly about it.
Yeah, listen, I love the book and even the process that you went about, because I follow you on the Pinkcast and all that stuff I want to get into. 7 books. So let me ask you this, is you've probably got the process of, writing and getting a book published down pretty pat at this point. Is the thrill the same, the 7th book on the shelf, as it was the first couple? Like, 7 in, I mean, it's not like Stephen King with 7 a week or anything, but is it still exciting for you?
Yeah, it's still pretty exciting, but here's the thing: it's still a slog. It's really, at least for me, it's really, really hard to write a book. And you would think number 7 would be easier, and it wasn't. It was still really hard.
And you and I talked on our last podcast, and I'll leave it for the viewers to go back on the process. It was a really interesting process about how you work and how you assemble the narrative and all those things. All right, so let's talk about the book. So what got you interested? I mean, there's a wide variety of things you can write a book about, I guess. What first honed you into this idea of regret?
The main thing is that I realized I had regrets of my own. And the forcing function for that, I think, was one of my daughter's college graduation. She graduated from university a couple of years ago. And I'm sitting at this graduation and I'm just having this out-of-body experience because I can't believe this kid who was just born is graduated from college. And I also can't believe that I have a kid who's graduating from college because I'm only 28. How is that even possible? You've been there. And so I start thinking about my own college experience and I started thinking about my regrets. And I had some. I felt like I could have worked harder. I felt like I could have taken more chances. I felt like I could have been a kinder person. And when I came back, I started talking to I was skittish about it, but I started talking to people about it. And I found that when I started talking about my regrets, people wanted to share theirs, that this was a topic that people really leaned in on. And that surprised me. And that's always a good sign for a writer. And so I was intrigued. I was actually working on an entirely different book at the time. And I put that aside. I started looking to see what the academic research looked like on regret. I found it pretty interesting. And I decided to change course. And so this book was, I think, somewhat personal for me. I don't know if I would have written this book in my 30s, but in my 50s, it felt kind of inevitable.
You start the book talking about this. We were joking off mic about the tattoo, the credo, no regrets. Though a lot of people have it. I mean, you start telling stories about the no regrets, and you interestingly describe this no regrets doctrine, or whatever we want to call it, as almost dangerous, which is a pretty strong word.
Yeah.
Now, when did this philosophy of not looking back and saying, I got no regrets, I'm only moving forward. Was it always so, or did it somehow grab the culture in some way, shape, or form?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure. It's been around for a lot of the 20th century. So we have, in the 1960s at least, or second half of the 20th century, we had Edith Piaf singing her song that, she doesn't regret anything. And then we had Ella Fitzgerald singing a song called No Regrets. And then Emmylou Harris singing a song called No Regrets. And Eminem singing a song called No Regrets. So I think it's certainly been very prominent in post-war North America and Europe. And, I think it correlates to the rise of some of the positive thinking philosophy that came up especially in the United States in the 20th century.
Well, I'll bring up another famous musician, Old Blue Eyes. Regrets, I've had a few. So let's talk about regret as a positive force. So as I would expect you have done, you did some great work on understanding brain development, brain science, and brain psychology. You talk about regret more understood by development psychologists as a marker of development rather than some kind of deficit. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I'm glad you picked up on that, because that's one of the things that's really important in understanding this emotion, is that everybody has regrets. Okay? Everybody has regrets. Regrets make us human. So, for instance, 5-year-olds don't have regrets. Why? Because their brains haven't developed enough. That it takes a certain amount of dexterity to be able to actually process regret, to go backward in time, to imagine a different past, which would then create a different future. And so for developmental psychologists, as you say, regret is a marker for cognitive maturation. So, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds start to experience regret. By adolescence, it's usually fully formed. And what this tells us, in part, and some other things tell us this too, is that our brains are pre-programmed for regret. And the reason for that, so you see it also in research showing that people with certain kinds of brain lesions can't experience regret. People with certain kinds of Huntington's can't experience regret.
Sociopaths. It's almost a definition of sociopaths, right? They don't have normal emotions.
Right. And so the idea is that regret is part of the human experience. It makes us human. But a reason that it's part of the human experience is that it's functional, that it's there for a reason. There's a reason we feel regret. And the reason we feel regret is that regret instructs us. Regret clarifies the future for us. Regret helps us get better if we treat it right. And that's the key.
I never thought of this before, but listening to you, I think of, in Catholicism, you, as a youth, it's around 7 or 8 where you start going to confession. And it's a funny thing, because when I think back to confession, it's like you almost you're waiting to do your first confession. You're trying to what can I confess to? What did I do wrong? You don't, it's a little function of regret. And it feels like it's purposefully weighted a little longer in the development, because it's hard to, as you say, when you're 5, you're I don't know what to confess to. I didn't do anything wrong.
That's interesting. That's interesting. So, just in general, if you don't have regrets, it means that your brain hasn't matured, or it's suffering from some grave problem. So it's really important for us to normalize regret and to make sure that we understand that it is an essential component of the human experience. But then also, and it has a lot of benefits. It can help us make better decisions. It can help us solve problems faster, become better strategists. But we have to treat it right. And here's the thing. So on one extreme is this ridiculous philosophy of no regrets, where we just simply ignore our negative emotions. But on the other extreme is this idea of wallowing in our regrets, ruminating over them. And that's bad too. What we want to do is we want to use our regrets as signals, as information, as a message from the universe that you need to do some things differently or do things in a different way.
Yeah, the book is full of anecdotes, and you took a path to do that by reaching out to your community. You did something that of all people, Stats Canada, the government statistics organization, did. They launched something called Stats Cannabis. So they actually had no idea how to dimensionalize the recreational cannabis market, because it was illegal. So they asked people, and they said, go on and tell us how much you use, what did you pay for it, and where did you buy it? And it turned out to be a wonderful, people just flooded in. Now, you took a not dissimilar tack. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, thanks for comparing me to StatsCan, because I admire that statistical agency big time. Well, what I did is I did two things. One is I did a quantitative survey of the U.S. population to try to understand people's attitudes toward regret and see whether there were differences by different demographics. But the other thing that I did, which proved actually in many ways much more fruitful, was what I call the World Regret Survey, where I simply, like Stats Can, I went out and collected 16,000 regrets from 105 countries. It's incredible.
16,000.
16,000 regrets from people in 105 countries. 105.
You've got a big community of people who follow you, but you don't have 16,000 people who follow you, I don't think.
Who are willing to contribute their deepest regret? No, it started spreading in a way that was just shocking to me. And I think that tells us something. It tells us how much people do want to talk about this. I did essentially no promotion beyond a couple tweets, and we ended up with, and we're getting more each day. Every time I go into the database, I see that, there are 23 people adding regrets right now. So it suggests that people do want to talk about this. But what this trove of 16,000 regrets from 105 countries was just really fascinating and revealing. And what I discovered from there, as you know, Mike, from reading the book, is that around the world, over and over and over again, people have the same four regrets. It's amazing. And these four regrets themselves are very revealing.
Yeah, and that's the wonderful thing about your process. You didn't just use it for anecdotes. I think you used it as a kind of almost a more than primary research. You extracted from it these types. So let's go take us through the four types of regret, how you classify these regrets.
So one regret is what I call foundation regrets. Foundation regrets are, if only I'd done the work. These are regrets that people have about not having a stable platform for their lives, smoking, not exercising, not working hard enough in school. So decisions they make early in their life often that end up creating some instability in their lives later on. The second category, fascinating category, are boldness regrets. Boldness regrets are, if only I'd taken the chance. And it doesn't matter the domain of life that you're in. It could be asking somebody out on a date. It could be starting a business. It could be traveling, whatever. What happens is people find themselves at a juncture. They can go two ways. They can play it safe or they can take the chance. When they play it safe, many times, they regret it. So that's boldness regrets. The third category,
and the story I'll relate to the listeners is there's the story of a person on a train, and this is a first party story. And he met this wonderful woman, and they started talking, and they hit it off. And then at some point, she got off the train and invited him, and he didn't go, and the door closed. And then looked back at that one little moment in his life as what you described as that boldness regret.
Yeah, I think the lesson there, Mike, is step off the train.
Yeah,
truly. Like people, even if you step off the train and nothing, and I have stories of this, people step off the train and it doesn't work out. They're okay with that.
Right.
But it's the not stepping out the train, not taking that chance. And I think that these boldness regrets are fascinating because, each of these four regrets revealed something fundamental about the human condition. I think that these four core regrets show us what constitutes the good life. But what it suggests to us is that, we want a stable platform for our lives. We don't want instability, but we also want a chance to do something, to learn, to grow, to lead a psychologically rich life. And I think that's like a really important lesson. Like there are like understanding the regrets of all these people around the world gives us direction, gives us clues about what really matters in life. And one of the things that ultimately matters to people very deeply is doing something, taking the chance. And then there's a third category, which is moral regrets. Moral regrets are, if only I'd done the right thing. So these are people who regret marital infidelity, cheating, stealing, bullying other people. So it's a pretty interesting category, very small, but pretty interesting. But again, that suggests, I think it's a heartening category because I got all these people who are regretting these things earlier in their life, which suggests that like most people want to be good, which is, I think, heartening. And then finally, there are connection regrets. And connection regrets are, if only I'd reached out. And connection regrets are ultimately about relationships. They are about any kind of relationship, not only romantic relationships, but other family relationships, and especially friendships, which prove to be incredibly important to people. And with connection regrets, what you have is you have a relationship that should have been intact, or that once was intact, and it comes apart, and usually in undramatic ways, usually just by drifting apart. And what happens is that somebody wants to reach out. They think it's going to be awkward. They think the other side's not going to care, so they don't reach out, and they drift a little more, and then they end up regretting it. So, so I think that connection regrets tell us about our fundamental need for affinity, for love. And so what I think is interesting about these 4 regrets, and this research took me to a place that I didn't expect to land, is that these 4 regrets are as I say in the book, a photographic negative of the good life. That is, if we understand what people regret the most, we understand what they value the most. And so this emotion, this, aversive emotion, like, I don't like regret. Nobody likes regret. But it actually teaches us, it instructs, it clarifies. And if we pay attention to it, it actually can point us toward a life well lived.
We're living through interesting times. I mean, I was reflecting on that last regret of reaching out to people and staying in touch. I mean, it's been a long time that I've reached out, on one hand, to have a coffee with people. It used to be kind of something I did all the time. And on the other hand, in some ways, I have more Zoom meetings with people. Hey, you and I haven't talked in a year. Let's get on a Zoom together. As you reflect on all your understanding of regrets and the place we are in our lives in the COVID era, do you think the COVID era will have an effect of diminishing regrets? In other words, after what I've gone through, it's like the roaring 20s. I don't care anymore. I'm not looking back. Or, in other words, a counterforce, because the feeling of being constrained released a little bit. Or have you put any thought into how on earth all of this is going to impact us for the rest of our lives?
I'm not sure, but I actually think that the last 2 years have been a time of forced reflection for people. Mm-hmm. And when they reflect on what ultimately matters in their life. And I think they're having those kinds of conversations. And those kinds of conversations, because they're human beings, inevitably turn back to regret. And I do think that part of this great resignation is fueled by, I feel like I have some regrets about the rest of my life. I've been reckoning with mortality, and maybe I need to do things differently in the future.
Maybe I should have been bolder. Maybe I should have taken that job, or leave that job I absolutely despise with more confidence.
I think that a lot of the great resignation are people who are acting on boldness regrets.
You bring forward one of my very favorite cognitive biases in the book, the escalating commitment to a failing course of action. I love that bias, because it and you talk about, when you get in a hole, stop digging kind of anecdote. But the failure to acknowledge regrets, you kind of characterize as, well, that's almost like you're just going to dig yourself deeper, because at some point you got to realize, more commitment to this course of action is not going to work. In other words, I think sometimes in our culture, you got to put in the effort. You got to be persistent. If you be persistent, maybe a bit lucky, maybe persistent, you'll get out of the hole you're in, or the course of action will pay off on all those investments. But you seem to think that regrets are like an antidote to that you'll find that sweet spot maybe a little easier?
Well, I mean, there's actually some explicit research on this that Gillian Koo at London Business School has done research showing that when you get people to reflect on previous escalations of commitment, all right, so escalation of commitment to a failing course of action, which, exactly as you say, it's like, stop digging a deeper hole for yourself. Yeah. So you can take an action like that. Okay, let's say that you've doubled down your investment in something that you knew was losing, and you said, "Oh my God, this is a totally losing investment." But I've already invested. I've sunk these costs in here. I'm going to actually double my investment to try to recoup it. Now you can look at that and you can say, "Do you regret that?" No, I have no regrets. I have no regrets at all. You should regret that. And what Gillian Koo's research has told us is that if you get people to stop and think about that, hey, I regret doing that. I regret doing that for the following reasons. Leaning into the regret, acknowledging it rather than patting it away, that people are less likely to fall through that trapdoor in the future. And we see this with certain kinds of negotiation mistakes. We see it with certain kinds of strategic mistakes. We see it with problem solving, that acknowledging our regrets, just sort of inviting that spear of negativity and then learning from it is actually helpful to us.
Is the counterpoint to that pride or embarrassment? In other words, you've got to get past your pride that you made a decision and you're confident in it, but now you got regrets. Like it sometimes it's a difficult emotion to wrangle down. Yeah.
I agree. I think that part of it is pride and ego. Now, here's the other thing, the dirty little secret, is that when we disclose our regrets, or even when we disclose any of our vulnerabilities, mistakes, setbacks, whatever, we fear that people will think less of us. And there's 30 years of research in behavioral science showing that that's wrong. They often think more of us. They admire our candor. They admire our courage. They empathize with us. And so that fear is often misplaced. And so this is, I'll give you another, I'll see your that cognitive bias and raise you a cognitive bias here. Let's talk about pluralistic ignorance, where you say, well, I believe this one thing, but no one else believes it. And that's a big trap here. So if you ask most people, so let's say that you have a friend named Fred, and Fred admitted a regret that he had about some mistake that he made in the past. Would you think less of him? Most people would say, of course I wouldn't think less of him. I actually would admire him admitting it and trying to do something about it. And yet, well, why don't you apply that to yourself? Oh my God, no! If I had, and so that's one of the big. That's one of the big problems that we have. That's one of the big problems that we have. We're wrong about many different things. We're wrong about, in many cases, these feelings of awkwardness about reaching out. People are, you drift apart from a friend, and you think, oh, it's going to be really awkward if I reach out, and they're not going to care anyway. And then if you turn it around on that person and say, well, what if this friend reached out to you? How would you feel? Oh my God, I would be the greatest thing. I would be so touched.
Right.
And so, we're trapped in that pluralistic ignorance as well.
So interesting. I want to ask you one thing. I meant to ask you about the cover of the book, and you actually collaborated with your community about the cover of the book. Tell me about how the cover of the book evolved.
Well, this is, I always look to see, I'll tell you, I'll give you the somewhat sort of narrow-minded, reductive way I sometimes think about these things. So if you're writing a book, if I'm writing a book, and the book is basically about an idea, all right, it's not about a thing, it's not about a person, it's not about a place, it's not about something concrete, it's about something abstract. Then I always think to myself, what is the Nike swoosh of this idea? All right, what is a single visual embodiment of this idea? And it's very, 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 very hard. Very, very hard. In this case, our designer, David Littman, came up with something I think pretty ingenious, which was a crumpled piece of paper. Because I think that's what regret is. We crumpled piece of paper, and we want to throw it away. What I want to say is like, hey, wait a second, that crumpled piece of paper might contain knowledge, information, lessons that you can use going forward.
Well, listen, let's end our time together the way you end the book. Advice for listeners about the power of regret. How would you sum it up?
Well, so one thing is to recognize that if you have regrets, that's not a problem. That's a sign of your humanity. Regrets don't make you weaker. They can, done right, make you stronger. And then, in the book, I talk about some of the very, very specific ways that you can address your regrets, whether it's undoing certain regrets, whether it's in certain cases simply getting past them by finding a silver lining in them. And then also a process by which you can reframe the way you think about yourself, disclose the regret as a way of making sense of it, and then try to extract a lesson from it. And so I really do, the goal of this work is to try to reclaim this misunderstood emotion, because I think that if we start acknowledging our regrets like grown-ups and start thinking about our regrets and start not falling through the trapdoor of wallowing or this blithe, no regrets nonsense that we can use, especially now at this moment that we're in, when you get a sense that we're turning a page in history, that we can use our regrets as a powerful force going forward.
Well, my guest is Daniel H. Pink. The book is The Power of Regret, How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward. It's out now in all the wonderful places you buy books. And I have to say, if you do not pick this book up, you will regret it. So there you go. Dan, thanks so much for joining me again on the Voice of Retail podcast. I'll put a link into our last conversation because you kind of got into how you approach books, the trade craft, which was so fascinating, and some of your prior work. But for now, I wish you continued success with the book. And it was great to speak with you. Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Mike, always a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning into this special episode of The Voice of Retail. If you haven't already, be sure and click and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so new episodes will land automatically twice a week. And check out my other retail industry media properties, the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Conversations with Commerce Next podcast, and the Food Professor podcast with Dr. Sylvain Charlebois. Last but not least, if you're into barbecue, check out my all-new YouTube barbecue show, Last Request Barbecue, with new episodes each and every week. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, president of M.E. LeBlanc Company and Maven Media. And if you're looking for more content or want to chat, follow me on LinkedIn or visit my website at meleblanc.co. Have a safe week, everyone.